night had been cold, a raw, biting chill that had settled in with the falling sun. For most, it was just the usual October evening, the kind that made you pull your jacket tighter and light a fire in the hearth. But for Garrett, the cold had a weight to it, a presence. It pressed against his skin like a warning. He'd been hunting for years since he was a boy, following his father through the woods, learning the ways of the land. He knew these forests like the back of his hand, could read the trails and know what animal had passed through hours, sometimes days, before. Tonight, though, it felt different. It was like the woods were holding their breath, waiting. Garrett had set out earlier in the day, tracking the signs of a large buck that had been moving through the area. It was a prize, one that had eluded hunters for weeks, and he wanted it. More than anything, he needed it. His family relied on the meat, and with winter approaching, this hunt had to be successful. But the deeper he went into the forest, the more uneasy he felt, as if something was watching him from just out of sight. He'd shrug off the feeling at first. It was nothing, just the wind, or maybe the way the trees swayed in the moonlight. But as the hours wore on, the unease gnawed at him. The woods seemed to quiet, the usual night sounds, crickets, the occasional rustle of a deer gone. Garrett paused, squatting by a patch of earth where the buck had left fresh prints. He studied the tracks, noting their deep, heavy indentation in the damp ground. It had to be close, he could feel it in his bones. But still, the silence held. His breath misted in the air as he stood up, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling. The wind had stopped, and the trees around him were eerily still. No leaves rustling, no branches creaking, just silence. His rifle felt heavier in his hands, the cold metal somehow a burden now. Garrett shook his head. Get a grip, he told himself. You're a hunter. This is just nerves. He pushed forward, following the tracks deeper into the woods. The canopy above was dense, the only light coming from the sliver of moon hanging high in the sky. His boots made soft thudding sounds on the soft earth, his breath sharp in the cold air. Time passed, he couldn't say how much, and soon the woods grew darker, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. The trail had taken him off the main path and into the heart of the forest, a place few ventured into. It was then that he heard it, a low sound at first, like a distant growl. He froze, straining his ears. The sound grew louder, closer, and it wasn't the sound of any animal he knew. It wasn't the grunt of a bear or the snort of a deer. It was deeper, almost human, but with an unmistakable animal edge. A chill ran down his spine. Hello. Garrett called out, his voice rough in the cold air. The noise stopped immediately. He waited. Nothing. The hairs on his neck stood up like a warning. His instinct screamed at him to turn around, to go back the way he came, but he couldn't. Not now. Not with the buck so close. He pressed on, but now his every step felt wrong. Each crack of a twig beneath his feet echoed like a gunshot in the stillness. His heart began to race, but he kept moving, ignoring the gnawing sense that something was following him, just out of sight. He reached a small clearing, the pale moonlight casting strange shadows on the ground. There, in the center of the clearing, stood the buck. It was a magnificent creature, the largest Garrett had ever seen. Its antlers rose high above its head, like jagged spikes reaching toward the sky. Its fur was thick, its coat a rich brown that blended with the surrounding shadows. For a moment, Garrett just stared at it, struck by awe. This was the one he had been tracking all this time. The one that had evaded every other hunter. But as his hand tightened on the rifle, he noticed something else. The buck wasn't moving. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, its body rigid and still. Its eyes, wide and unblinking, glowed in the moonlight, but there was something wrong about them. They didn't have the soft, familiar warmth of a living animal. They were cold, empty, like to black holes. Suddenly, the air grew colder still, a biting frost sweeping through the clearing. Garrett's breath came out in clouds, and his fingers began to tremble on the rifle. This isn't right, he thought. The buck's not supposed to be like this. Then, the thing moved. It wasn't the buck that moved, but something else, something from the shadows. A figure, tall and hunched, stepped into the moonlight. It was human in shape, but twisted, its arms too long and its legs too short. The thing's skin was a sickly, mottled gray, stretched thin over bone and muscle, and its face. Its face was a nightmare. The features were faint, as if they'd been carved into the thing's skull. There was no nose, just to gaping holes. Its mouth was a wide, gaping maw, filled with rows of jagged teeth. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were sunken deep into its face, dark as the void. It moved with a terrifying speed, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it approached Garrett. Garrett's heart slammed in his chest. He raised the rifle, hands shaking, but the creature was already too close. It reached out with impossibly long fingers, its nails sharp as daggers. A voice low, guttural whispered in his mind, not in words, but in a feeling. "You should not have come here." Garrett's finger squeezed the trigger, but the bullet never left the chamber. The creature was upon him now, its fingers curling around his wrist, its grip like ice. His body froze, not from the cold, but from terror. The rifle fell from his hands, clattering against the ground. The last thing Garrett saw was the buck, standing motionless in the clearing, its eyes still glowing in the darkness. And then, the forest was silent once more. The next morning, hunters from nearby farms gathered, drawn by the distant sound of shots and the strange stillness that had settled over the woods. They searched for hours, calling Garrett's name, but found nothing. The trail had disappeared into the dense forest, and no trace of him remained. A few weeks later, one of the hunters came across a strange set of tracks, large, deep imprints in the ground that led toward the center of the forest. The prints weren't from any animal he recognized. They looked wrong, too large, too heavy. But when the hunter reached the clearing, he found nothing. Only the pale remnants of frost on the ground. And in the distance, a single buck, its antlers rising toward the sky like jagged spires. In the years that followed, the woods became known as the Hunter's Hollow. No one ventured too far into the heart of it, and those who did often came back with strange stories, whispers of figures in the shadows, the sounds of growls in the night, and eyes that glowed from the dark. Some said it was the spirit of the forest, angry for the men who had hunted too much. Others said it was something older, something that had always been there, waiting. But the truth remained hidden, deep in the woods. A place where the hunters became the hunted, and the forest held its secrets close, behind its quiet, watching eyes. And sometimes, if you listened closely enough, you could still hear the low, haunting growl echoing through the trees. The kind of sound that made you wonder, what was really hunting whom? The early morning fog hung heavy over the valley, wrapping the trees in a blanket of moisture. The air was thick with the scent of wet pine and damp earth. Logan adjusted the straps of his backpack, the weight of the rifle settled against his shoulder, and he exhaled a slow breath. The woods were still, eerily so, but then again, it was just before dawn, the world not yet awake. He'd been hunting these mountains his whole life. His father had taken him out as a boy, teaching him the ways of the woods, the deer trails, the wind patterns, the quiet patience needed to track game. Logan had learned to read the forest like a book, and after years of experience, he'd come to think he knew it better than anyone. He'd spent his fair share of cold mornings alone in these hills, tracking elk, bear, and deer, always with the quiet comfort that the forest was just another place he belonged. But today felt different. He couldn't quite place it. He checked the time on his watch, 5:15 a.m. It was the perfect hour to be out here. Just enough light filtering through the mist to see, but not enough for the animals to sense his presence. His goal for the day was simple: bring home a buck for the freezer before the snow really hit. The forecast had called for storms in a few days, and he'd learned long ago that it was best to get the big game early, before the weather turned unpredictable. Logan made his way through the forest, moving with deliberate silence. His boots left barely a mark on the soft earth, and his breath came slow and steady as he worked his way deeper into the woods, following the path his father had taught him to take. There were signs of deer activity, a broken twig here, a patch of trampled moss there, but nothing recent. He pressed on, eyes scanning the ground for the next clue. By the time the sun began to rise, the fog had started to lift, and the dense trees around him began to take shape. The quiet of the morning was almost peaceful, but a strange unease clung to the air, like something was just out of reach, watching him. Logan shook it off. Just nerves, he thought. He'd been out here before. He was a professional. He stopped at a familiar clearing, a wide space where the deer often came to graze in the early mornings. The ground was soft, but there were no fresh tracks. Logan frowned. He glanced around, looking for any sign of movement in the trees, but everything was still. Too quiet, he thought. Logan set his pack down and crouched low, scanning the area with the practiced eyes of a hunter. The forest around him was silent, save for the occasional rustle of a branch. His hand hovered over the grip of his rifle, his body tense. He'd hunted here many times, but today, it felt as though the woods were holding their breath. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Minutes passed, and still, there was no movement. He decided to move on, choosing a different route deeper into the woods. He threaded his way through thick underbrush, the faint sounds of his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. He didn't know why, but today, everything felt off. The sun had risen higher now, and the forest was bathed in soft, golden light. As Logan moved deeper, the ground began to incline, and the trees grew thicker. This was where the older, larger bucks were known to roam their territory, and the place Logan hoped to find his prize. But as he trudged through the dense forest, an odd chill seemed to settle in, despite the warmth of the morning sun. It wasn't until he reached a small, narrow creek that he noticed it. A scent, not the usual smell of wet earth, pine needles, or fresh game. No, this was something different, something foul. Logan paused, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He leaned down, sniffing the air. The smell was thick rotting flesh, burnt hair, something dead. His stomach twisted in response, but he forced himself to focus. He scanned the area around the creek, trying to locate the source of the odor. Then, he saw it. Not far from the water, partially hidden by the thick brush, was a carcass. A large animal, maybe a deer, maybe something larger. But as Logan approached, something didn't add up. The body was shredded, but not in a way that any predator he knew would do. The flesh had been torn in jagged, unnatural pieces, like something had used its hands to rip it apart. The bones were exposed in places, the body mutilated beyond recognition. Logan's stomach churned. This wasn't the work of a bear. Bears didn't leave bodies like this, and the smell it was too sour, too wrong for any animal in these woods. His instinct screamed at him to turn around, to leave this place and never return. But he couldn't. He had to know what had happened. Logan carefully stepped forward, his boots crunching on the dry leaves, his heart pounding in his chest. As he knelt beside the carcass, his eyes scanned the ground for clues. The tracks around the body were large, distorted, not human, but not animal either. The prints looked like a twisted amalgamation of both half claw, half boot. His hand gripped the rifle tighter. He didn't know what kind of creature had done this, but it was something unnatural, something wrong. The silence around him grew heavier, the air thicker with each passing second. Then he heard it, a soft, raspy sound from the brush behind him. Logan froze. His breath caught in his throat as the hairs on his neck prickled. Slowly, he turned, his eyes scanning the thick foliage surrounding him. Nothing. But the noise came again. A soft rustling, then a snap of a twig. Something's following me. His instinct screamed, but his body moved before his mind could catch up. Logan spun on his heel, raising the rifle and scanning the area. His eyes darted from tree to tree, the forest feeling suddenly too alive, too aware of him. And then he saw it. A figure hunched, crouched low, moving quickly through the trees. At first, Logan thought it was a person, but as the figure stepped into a patch of sunlight, his breath hitched in his throat. It was no man. The thing was tall, its back hunched like a beast, its limbs long and unnaturally thin. It had the face of a man, but something was wrong with it. Its eyes were too wide, its mouth too thin, stretched in a grotesque grin. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and its teeth glinted in the light like a predator's. Logan's finger tightened on the rifle's trigger, but his body wouldn't move. He was paralyzed by the sight of the thing, and in that instant, it locked eyes with him. The creature made a sound, a low, throaty growl, like the sound of a wild animal, but with an intelligence behind it, something calculating. It took a slow step toward him, and then another, its movements fluid and unnatural, like it was gliding through the underbrush. Logan didn't wait, he fired. The shot rang out, the blast deafening in the silence of the forest. The creature didn't flinch, it didn't even seem to notice. It moved with terrifying speed, closing the distance between them in an instant. The rifle dropped from Logan's hands as the creature lunged, its long fingers gripping his arm with the strength of iron. Logan fought back, kicking and thrashing, but it was no use. The creature was too strong, too fast. It yanked him off his feet and dragged him backward through the trees, its breath hot and putrid on his face. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent. Days later, a group of searchers came through the woods, looking for Logan. His truck was found at the edge of the forest, the engine still running, but there were no tracks leading into the woods, and no sign of him anywhere. The only thing they found was a single bullet casing, lying on the ground near the creek. The woods were silent, as they always were, but now, no one dared to venture too deep. Eli was used to being alone in the woods. For years, he'd hunted these hills in the Appalachian foothills of western North Carolina, tracking deer, boar, and the occasional black bear. The land was rugged, raw, and unforgiving, but it was home. And when he wasn't working his day job at the local auto repair shop, he was in the woods, taking his time, breathing the pine-scented air, and setting up for his next hunt. That fall, he decided to head deeper into the hollows than usual. It was the end of October, the days growing shorter, and the first real frost had come in the night before, blanketing the forest in a brittle, icy sheen. The bucks were in rut, and Eli had been tracking one, in particular a large 10-pointer that had been spotted in the area by other hunters. He'd been trailing it for days, slowly creeping further into a part of the forest where few people dared to go. This was not the easy land near the valley. No, this was old-growth forest, thick and unkempt, the kind of place where the trees were so densely packed that sunlight only ever touched the forest floor in dappled spots. The locals called it Devil's Hollow, though no one could quite say why. Some said it was because the area had once been the site of a bloody skirmish during the Civil War, while others whispered of strange occurrences, people hearing voices, seeing figures in the woods at night. Of course, Eli didn't put much stock in such stories. He was a man of reason, and he knew the woods. He'd spent enough time here to understand that most things could be explained by the natural world. The strange sounds people heard were just the wind shifting, the shadows in the trees were just that, shadows. But as he packed his gear into the back of his old pickup that morning, there was something different in the air. The breeze was colder than usual, and the trees seemed darker, even for this time of year. Eli shrugged it off. There was work to be done. The forest grew thicker as he moved further into the hollow. The path he followed narrowed, a winding trail that had been little more than a deer path. He had to step carefully, watching the uneven ground for roots and rocks that might trip him. His boots crunched over the fallen leaves, and in the distance, he could hear the occasional rustle of animal movement. But even with all the sounds of life around him, there was a heavy silence that clung to the air. Not the peaceful quiet of nature, but something unsettling, like the forest was holding its breath. Eli paused near a large oak to check his map and GPS. The hollow wasn't on any official trail, but he'd hunted here before. He knew these woods. Yet, when he looked up from his phone, the trees around him seemed unnaturally still, as if the world had suddenly paused. He shook his head, trying to shake the feeling. The kind of feeling he'd had a few times before, but always dismissed too many beers or not enough sleep. Still, a twinge of unease gnawed at the pit of his stomach. He gripped his rifle tighter and set off again. The wind picked up as the hours passed, swirling around him and stirring the dead leaves beneath his feet. By noon, he was deep into the heart of the hollow. The trees here were older, their trunks gnarled and twisted like ancient hands. The underbrush was thick, and the ground beneath his boots grew soft with moss. Eli moved quietly, eyes trained on the ground ahead of him, scanning for any sign of his target. By mid-afternoon, the sun had begun to sink behind the ridgeline, casting long shadows across the forest floor. That's when he found it, his first real sign. Fresh tracks, deep hoofprints in the damp earth, leading off the main trail and up a small ridge toward a thicket of dense underbrush. Eli smiled to himself. The buck had to be close. He loaded his rifle with care, moving slowly and deliberately toward the ridge, his boots barely making a sound on the soft, spongy earth. But as he crested the ridge and peered over the edge, the world suddenly seemed different. The trees seemed to close in on him, and the air grew colder. The tracks led to a small clearing, but there was something wrong about it. The trees around the clearing were twisted and deformed, their branches curling at odd angles, as if they'd been bent by some unseen force. The ground was bare of undergrowth, the earth hard and cracked. It looked unnatural to perfect, to still. Eli frowned. his breath forming a mist in the suddenly cold air. There was something off about this place, but he couldn't put his finger on it. The clearing stretched before him, an island of stark earth surrounded by the dark forest. He slowly moved toward it, his senses heightened, his rifle at the ready. The tracks led straight into the center of the clearing. His heart quickened as he stepped closer, and then something moved. A figure, half hidden behind a large rock at the far end of the clearing. At first, Eli thought it was just a deer. But as he squinted into the gathering dusk, he realized it wasn't a deer at all. It was a man, at least. It looked like one. Tall, gaunt, dressed in tattered clothes, its body unnaturally thin, its face obscured by a hood. Eli's pulse raced. He didn't know why, but every instinct in him screamed danger. This wasn't just some lost hiker or hunter. This was something else. The figure didn't move, just stood there, motionless, staring back at him with an intensity that felt suffocating. Without thinking, Eli raised his rifle. "Who's there?" He called out, his voice rough in the still air. The figure didn't answer. It didn't even twitch. But as Eli stared, his eyes narrowing, something shifted. The air seemed to grow even colder, and he realized that the figure wasn't just standing still. It was waiting. A flash of movement in the corner of his vision snapped him from his stupor. He whipped around, rifle aimed, but there was nothing there. He turned back to the figure and it was gone. Eli's heart hammered in his chest. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He could hear the sound of his own breathing, but the forest was silent once more. His eyes scanned the clearing, the shadows creeping in as the sun dipped lower. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He turned on his heel and began to move quickly back toward the trail. Every crack of a twig underfoot made his pulse spike. His mind raced with thoughts of what he'd seen, if he'd seen anything at all. Maybe he'd imagined it, or maybe it had been a trick of the light, but deep down, he knew he hadn't. As he made his way back through the trees, the strange sensation of being followed grew stronger. He kept checking over his shoulder, every rustle in the underbrush making him tense. When the first few stars appeared in the sky, he was already out of the thickest part of the hollow and back on the main trail. But then he stopped. Just ahead, there was a figure standing at the edge of the forest, just out of reach of the dimming light of dusk. Eli's breath caught. It was the same figure. Its outline was barely visible in the twilight, its thin body just a silhouette against the trees. This time, it didn't move. It didn't speak. And that's when Eli realized the truth. There was no one else in the forest, no other hunters. He was alone. The forest had drawn him in, led him to that clearing where the figure had waited, and now it was following him. Not for any reason he could understand, but because it could, because it wanted to. Eli turned and ran, his boots pounding the dirt, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees shifting as though they were moving. The trail ahead became twisted, unfamiliar. The feeling of eyes watching him never left. Hours later, when the first light of dawn touched the horizon, Eli stumbled out of the woods. He was breathless, covered in sweat and dirt, but alive. He glanced back at the tree line, but there was no figure, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. But something inside him had changed. The hollow, the place they called Devil's Hollow, wasn't just some part of the forest. It was alive, ancient, waiting. And whatever it had been, whatever force had watched him from the darkness, was still out there, watching. And Eli knew, deep down, that one day, it would call him back. After that day, Eli never hunted in those woods again. The stories he'd heard as a boy of strange things that happened deep in the forest weren't just stories. They were warnings. And the next time the hollow called, he wouldn't be so lucky. Alright everyone, that brings us to the end of our story. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more content like this, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. And if you have similar stories you'd like to share with us, feel free to reach out. Thank you for watching, and until next time, take care.